Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this panel on what next for India. And as you know, India, we had regional elections across 5 states in January, February. And today, the three of us will be discussing that. What are the implications, what happened, and what this holds for the future of Indian polity and society. So welcome. I am Anwesha. I'm a senior researcher at the Kristen Michelson Institute here in Bergen. I do not directly work on Indian politics, but of course it's of great interest. You cannot be from India and not follow politics. I did do it, follow it quite a bit regionally when during my PhD, but I'm very happy to be here. We have with us Dr. Kenneth Nielsen. He's actually come here from Oslo. So Kenneth, quickly, what you do?
So I'm an anthropologist. I work in Oslo, and I also coordinate the Norwegian Network for Asian Studies. It's sort of on the side. I work on Indian politics, and I've done so for quite some time. Now it's perhaps a little bit more marginal to what I otherwise do, but it is something that I try to follow as best I can and to write about whenever I have the chance.
Thanks, Kenneth. And we also have with us Dr. Shrey Nishchal. Shrey, if you can quickly say what you do.
I can do. So I'm an assistant professor at the Høgskolen på Vestlandet here in Bergen. And I work mostly on institutions. I did a PhD on anti-corruption. And so I've been working a little bit on and off with India in my work. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So we'll get started. So I'm playing the role of a moderator, but also trying to sneak in my opinions where possible. And I also know personally that Shrey and Kenneth also have very interesting and different opinions on things. And that always makes it more interesting for us to see. Because as you know, India currently is quite a polarized country. I don't know how much you follow Indian politics in terms of the Hindutva projects we have had to touch upon it. But to give you very briefly the sheer numbers, what we are talking about here. So 5 states went to vote. And these states are Uttar Pradesh, Punjab. So Uttar Pradesh is in the north, Punjab also to the north. Then we had Goa, Uttarakhand also in the north. So 3 northern states, Goa to the west. Kenneth has done fieldwork in Goa. He has projects in Goa. And Manipur to the northeast. And that is where, so the other thing to tell you is that I am from northeast. I'm from Assam. So I have followed the Manipur case. Shrey is from Delhi. So he has been following UP and Punjab, and Kenneth has worked on Goa. So we do bring some regional expertise to the room. And in terms of number, in Uttar Pradesh, we had 150 million voters. In Punjab, 4 million voters. Goa, 1.2 million voters. Manipur, 800,000, and in Uttarakhand, 6.7 million. So even the sheer number of these 5 states is, I think, most of Western Europe and a few Eastern European states. But Kenneth will quickly start by giving us an introduction into how the voting structure works regionally. So if you could quickly do that, Kenneth.
Yeah, I'm not sure how required this is, but I do find sometimes when speaking to a Scandinavian audience who are unfamiliar with the Indian electoral system that it might be difficult to comprehend actually how a candidate is elected in the Indian context. I mean, we're used to, I'm from Denmark, it's the same system here basically, that we follow proportional representation. So if your party gets roughly 20% of the votes, you will have somewhere around 20% of the seats in parliament too. That's not the way it's done in India. India follows the system that we know from the UK, which is known as the first past the post system, which means that in each constituency, one person and one person only is elected. And that person is the one who gets the most votes. It's basically as simple as that. It also means that you can become elected, say if you get 25% of the votes, provided that all your opponents get 25% or less. That also means that quite a large number of votes may potentially be wasted. It is possible for a party to get an average of 25% of the votes across an entire state without having a single person elected to parliament, on the assumption that in each of these constituencies, there will be another person getting even more votes. So there's quite a considerable disconnect between the percentage of votes that a party gets and the number of politicians that a given party can send to the state assembly. And this is worth keeping in mind because when one sees the change in the composition of a state assembly, this can vary quite wildly from one election year to the next. I mean, it's not unusual for a party to double their number of elected politicians, which here would be considered a landslide. But in India, it can actually be achieved by only shifting a few percentages of the votes from one party to another. Or if there's increasing competition, if many new parties enter the fray, they tend to fragment the vote across many parties. And then it's actually easier to be elected with an even perhaps lower share of what you had last time around if people sort of distribute their votes across many different parties. So it's worth keeping in mind that although we see representation fluctuating wildly in some of these assemblies, the voting pattern in terms of percentage will usually be pretty not stable, but it won't fluctuate as much as the number of people different parties send to the assemblies.
Thanks, Kenneth, for this. And this is also important here because UP has the highest number of representatives who then go to the parliaments in the national elections. So what happens in UP now could be an indicator of what happens during the national elections in 2024. And that's why BJP, out of these 5 states, won in 4 states, except for one, which is Punjab. And that is where Shrey has been following Punjab very closely. And we thought we could pick up with a state where BJP did not make it. But Shrey, before that, if you could give a brief introduction as to how BJP came to power in India when, and how Punjab how Punjab was taken by the Aam Aadmi Party.
Okay, so 2014 was the turning point in Indian politics, I think. Before that, we had 10 years of Congress rule. So I was finishing my bachelor's degree that time, and there were these huge protests, and there was this big anti-corruption movement. Of course, in the back, there was BJP kind of pushing that movement. And it was just, people were so sick of Congress. I remember thinking, oh my God, I cannot vote for Congress anymore because there were these corruption scandals and just this whole thing about kind of this dynasty politics. Again, against the same family kind of ruling the country. People were just, I think, had enough. And then this new guy, Narendra Modi, he had been chief minister for many years in Gujarat. He came into the foray, and people liked him. People thought that, there was this Gujarat model discussion that, he had transformed the state of Gujarat from somewhat of a okayish state in India to a very well-performing state. And people thought, okay, if he's elected, we get that kind of same kind of prosperity all across India. So that's one. Of course, like over the course of the last 7-8 years, there have been other issues also, like that they kind of have a project of Hindutva and whatever. So we can talk more about that, but I guess that's another discussion. So talking about Punjab, BJP has never been a real player in Punjab. So it's always been, so Punjab, the state, is actually Sikh dominated. And the political parties that are kind of, the Shiromani Akali Dal, that's the kind of the dominant party, the dominant force there, was the dominant force there. They are very tightly connected to the kind of the religious authorities there. But lately, it seems like people don't like them or the Congress. So people are just kind of bored of that, I think. And Congress has really imploded. Congress was in power. They were thinking of, they could have won this easily. They could have won this easily. It was their election kind of to lose, and they lost it. They imploded in a way, and last minute changes in leadership, helter-skelter, people are running, and here we have a new player, Aam Aadmi Party. They did the same thing in Delhi. They are kind of giant killers, and now we have a new party in Punjab, whom the people kind of have high hopes from, and they have the kind of the same way of operating. They have kind of the similar welfare schemes. And maybe we can get back to this point that that the whole kind of spectrum in India has shifted to the right. We can talk about this, but I think for Punjab, it's enough. Yeah.
Thanks, Shrey. And what is also interesting for Punjab is if you had followed the farmer protest, which primarily came from Punjab, and we thought it would be a big issue for this election. But what we really found is that whether farmer protest or COVID or forms of religious polarization did not really influence the voters. And the more we read about it and also informally talked to people, the fundamental issues on the ground for each state were quite different. So and at the end of it, it became, so I can quickly get into, say, Manipur now, and then Kenneth can come in with Goa after. So Manipur is this state in northeast of India, which is, if you're aware of northeast of India, it's connected to the rest of India through what is called a chicken's neck. It's a narrow passage. And the 8 states now, Sikkim's been a state, were in some ways even forcibly coerced into being part of the Indian Federation. So since independence, almost all the states in northeast of India have had self-determination movements to secede from the Indian Federation. But constitutionally, that's not allowed. And Manipur is one of those states where we have had insurgency for separatism insurgency since the independence, so 40 years of insurgency. Now, since 2017, when BJP managed to come in with a bit of a vote share in Manipur, and between 2022, what we have seen is that the incidents of bomb blasts have really gone down. So I grew up in Assam, and when I was growing up, bomb blasts were like every few days we had a blast here and there. It was a daily occurrence. And in Manipur, even more so. It's such an insurgent state. It never comes to the picture because it's a fringe marginal state with less population, mountainous. They have direct relations with Myanmar. So there are reports that Manipur, there are insurgents in Manipur collaborating with the junta in Myanmar as well. So it's also part of what we call the Golden Quadrilateral, which is a drug trade and illegal wildlife trade corridor as well. So it's a very important borderland state, but politically, because of the numbers, only 800,000 people vote from there. So it doesn't make it to the big map. Now, since 2017, Manipur has not really had bomb blasts. The BJP actually, when they came to power nationally, they have managed to bring these insurgents to the table, to negotiate with them, to dialogue with them. The other problem with Manipur was you have a valley there and the hills, and the valley is dominated by this Meitei population, and there was a large-scale conflict between the valley and the hills, and there were low economic blockades on a daily basis. So people on the hills were obstructed of getting supplies. The BJP managed to curb that as well and bring these parties to table and negotiate with them as well. And that's why this time anti-incumbency, including BJP leaders traveling to Manipur, talking one-on-one with those militia groups. And what the militia groups then did was they issued a directive asking all the people to vote for BJP. So we don't know if these elections were as free and fair, but it seems to be very complex. On the one hand, you have these militia groups who now believe that BJP will help get their progress of their vision of getting a territorial council in Manipur. And at the same time, people are also in some ways happy because they no longer have to deal with bomb blast and insecurity and so on. And that also made northeast of India, which used to be largely dominated by regional parties, but since 2014, we are seeing increasingly BJP gaining ground. The other thing which, Kenneth, I think you should briefly touch before we proceed is the RSS wing of the BJP, who are kind of the foot soldiers of the BJP, but they're not really a political body, right? And the RSS are also even prevalent here in Scandinavia. So if you could quickly touch upon, and the groundwork they have been doing way before 2014, and that actually has helped BJP also come to power. And Kenneth,
just want to comment on, so you said that RSS is a wing of the BJP. I think BJP is a wing of
BJP is a wing of the RSS. Yeah, sorry.
RSS
RSS is this big organization, mainly an ideological organization, and then BJP emerged out of it as the political wing of the RSS. And of course, now we have seen some kind of skirmishes between them. But can I quickly on RSS, and then we probably go to Goa.
Great, thanks. I had many other things on my list of things to say, but so the RSS, I don't know if people are familiar with this, but it's an organization that turns 100 years old in a couple of years, formed back in the 1920s, inspired by Italian fascism first and foremost, but also somehow influenced by German Nazism in the interwar period. Set up in India in the 1920s. It's a volunteer organization. It works and has worked historically at the grassroots level for the promotion of the idea that India is a Hindu nation and that it should be defined accordingly. It's a grassroots organization. It has a reputation, at least it used to have, of the leadership being unselfish, honest, incorruptible, engaged in social work. It has today branched out. It has affiliate organizations of all kinds. There's women's groups, farmers' unions, organizations for Muslims, Christians, Dalits, Adivasis, you name it. A huge family of organizations. It must be the largest voluntary sector in the world, no? I think. Yeah. And it's done this grassroots work now for close to a century. If you're a Gramscian, you will recognize this as a way of building hegemony in civil society, working gradually by inculcating your ideology as a kind of common sense. It's tended to keep some distance towards party politics, believing that true social transformation happens in society, and that politics is somehow an icing on the cake that's not as significant in defining the nation. That's changed now, I think, for some decades, but at least under Modi, I think this interlocking between decades of work in civil society and the capture of state power has given this family of organizations tremendous influence, bridging the state-society divide. Yeah.
Okay, I ask one. Okay, I'm also learning about it. So just you talked about this kind of the inspiration being Italian fascism. How much of that do you think is still present today?
That's it's hard to say ideologically. No? I mean, and this is the interwar years. No? Many people were inspired by fascism. Conservative politicians across North Europe as well. In my home country, Denmark, it's a strong fascination for fascism, order, service, the uniforms, no, which you still see the RSS core members donning today. So there are certainly a flavor of this still in existence, also in the sort of the structure of the organization, the way it functions, its relative centralization, and so on. Okay.
But I think the point here is that the reason why RSS becomes important is that BJP coming to power in 2014 and continuing has a lot to do with the ideological presence of the RSS all over and the way it has been working one-on-one with people on the ground. And that should give you a context as to how, BJP continues to be in power. But of course, over the years, the relationship has on and off turned sore because Modi himself is a strong man and he wouldn't really be directed as much. But then now let's come back to the elections and what it holds. So I think Goa is an interesting example, a smaller state, rich in minerals, tourism, economy. And if Kenneth, you tell us a bit about Goa, what happened there?
Yeah, can I just take a short step backwards first? Because I don't think we've really told people sort of the aggregate outcome of these elections. Yes. And of course, people will likely know this. But in any case, there was a press conference with Amit Shah, who is the Indian Home Minister, a couple of days before the counting of the votes began. And he said, Prime Minister Modi is the most popular prime minister this country has ever had. Because of him, we will win 4 states. We will form the government in these 4 states. And we will improve our performance in the Punjab. And lo and behold, that happened. Even in the Punjab, they increased their vote share by a tiny fraction of a percentage. So this was, in a sense, a clean sweep for the BJP. And this is in contrast to 5 years ago, when we also had events like this. Back in 2017, Congress, as we heard, formed the government in the Punjab. And they actually won the elections in Manipur and Goa. Yeah. But they couldn't form the government. They didn't win handsomely enough. So in 2017, Congress could win elections and they could sometimes form government. This time, they couldn't win elections and they certainly couldn't form government.
I'll just interrupt you because you should explain to them that was so interesting how Congress won in Manipur and Goa, but how BJP in such a, I don't know what's a word I would use, managed to actually form the government. Do you see a party wins, but doesn't form the government? How does that happen?
Well, you can maybe explain that for Manipur also.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened in Goa, it's a small assembly. There are 14 members of the state assembly. So you need to cross the 20 elected, like a coalition of 20 elected members or more in order to form the government. And I think that, can't remember the exact figure last time, Congress won 17, 18 seats. They were so close to 20, and the BJP won less. So everybody was thinking, okay, over the next couple of days, Congress will make a few phone calls. They will bring in some independent candidates. Maybe they will lure other people into the fold and they will have enough support to form a government. But then the BJP acted much faster. They had only 13 elected members in the assembly, long distance up to 20, but they managed to rope in basically everybody who wasn't a Congress politician into a big coalition government. Manipur was
very similar. Manipur, same, a very little margin, and BJP went in very fast, what you call poaching. They poached in independents and others. And this actually tells you just how creative, efficient, and fast BJP's organizational strategy is when it comes to how they function. But yeah, and we can now fast forward to Goa now.
Yeah, so this year was a little, I mean, this is a small state and it's quite peculiar in that the constituencies are very small. How many voters are in a UP or Punjab assembly seat? Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
In Goa, you have constituencies with 20,000 voters maybe. So you can, this year, some candidates won their seat by a margin of 75 votes. It's really small margins. This year, the BJP won comfortably. They have a majority of their own in the state assembly. They won 20 seats, half of the seats in the assembly. They did so with roughly 1/3 of the popular vote. It means that every two out of three Goan voters voted for somebody else than the BJP. But still, the BJP managed to win a majority on their own. And that's because the opposition consisted of many different parties. There was the Congress, but there was also a range of other parties. Some local Goan parties, also the Aam Aadmi Party that was coming down to try their luck in a state located 2,000 kilometers from where the AAP headquarters is. A Bengali party also coming in. So there was a lot of fragmentation among the opposition parties, which meant that even with a relatively, not smaller, but 1/3 of the votes, it's a good performance. It's not outstanding, allowed the BJP to form the government there. So that fragmentation of the opposition vote, splitting the votes between them, resulting in most opposition candidates getting fewer votes in their constituencies. That kind of, to me at least, mirrors almost national politics. You have the BJP as the dominant force, lots of opposition, but it's fragmented and votes are being split among many different parties. Yeah.
So I totally agree with you about this. And technically, like to win these, we need like a opposition core around like a party that around whom like all the other parties kind of come together against the ruling party to defeat them. But I think that's just not happening because there's no central core.
Yeah.
And all these like fragments at the national level. It's India has had a very bad experience with third fronts and like non-BJP, non-Congress rules. Yeah.
I think currently we don't really have an opposition, that kind of an opposition,
a good opposition.
So Congress, what this elections is telling us is that Congress is gone. So we have regional parties now in other states, which are non-BJP ruled, but the Congress as a sizable opposition is ceasing to exist. And this brings me back to, so why, despite all these farmer protests, we know Delta, India with one of the highest numbers of death, hospitals running out of oxygen, collapsing of the health system. We know there are still incidents of lynchings against and beef bans, and we have a new cattle bill. Why, despite all this, so many voters are continuing to vote for BJP? And how does BJP continue to come back to power and pursuing this larger Hindutva project? And I think Uttar Pradesh, with 150 million voters, is a very interesting case in point. So Shrey, you can start.
I think if I just sum it up, it's efficient welfare delivery. Like poor people have got money in their bank accounts, and yeah, I think that's kind of the key factor here. Also, there are other things like security. People feel. I think a lot of women have voted for the BJP because they feel a little bit more secure than before. So I think. I don't know what kind of what is the credit to the polarization that they did, because they did a lot of polarization in UP as well. But I don't know like how much we can attribute their victory to that, because I think a lot of people have been kind of wooed by the kind of the free grain that they get during COVID. So I think if I can sum it up, it's the efficient service delivery that helped them, and of course they're an election winning machine. So they are very, very efficient when it comes to elections.
So the advertising, also like UP had we had the Bahujan Samaj party, like a Dalit party in power led by a woman. But then the BJP actually managed to topple them as well. And on the ground in UP, as Shrey mentioned, and this is something I've done some field work post-COVID and during COVID in India. And what we see is they have actually managed to work with the local institutional government, that is the panchayat in India, and have managed to do the last mile delivery to people. So they have connected women to financial organization. They have had schemes like the Ujjwala Yojana, which is supplying households with liquid petroleum gas. So we know that, collecting fuel wood and cooking is quite hazardous, time-taking for women. So now women have access to gas. They have had a huge toilet project. So often a lot of these rapes or violence against women happen because they had to go out at night for defecation, but now they have toilets because the BJP managed to build toilets. So there are these things they have done, but all their welfare services are extremely targeted. They have targeted them specifically to Muslims, targeted them to women, targeted them to children. So midday meal program, they have, the menus of, so children, so one way in India to keep marginalized children in school is to provide them with a meal. And for that one meal, a lot of children are attracted to go to school, and it's also good for the parents to send them because they don't have to feed these extra mouths. And BJP in UP has strategically done this nutrition programs.
But it's not just BJP, it's been a much older project.
It's a project, but they have managed to sustain it. So before we would hear a lot of corruption in midday meal, students getting bad quality food. And the other thing they have managed to do mobilize are the grassroots healthcare workers, what we call the ASHA workers. So ASHA workers have also been existing in India for many, many years. But with BJP, they have managed to kind of organize them and use them for service delivery. So a lot of decentralization and using Indian decentralization for delivery of these services. So I have a colleague that works on deepening democracy. And with BJP, this kind of a deepening democracy has happened. Whereas at the same time, we have to keep in mind, they continue to, it's a twofold process of extending their ideological project vis-a-vis trying to deepen democracy, because these elections are not that rigged or as violent as you would think in other parts. So yeah.
I just want to add one more thing about COVID, because, Uttar Pradesh, UP was one of the hardest hit states. Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, why didn't it have an impact? It's a good question to ask, people are bodies floating in the Ganges. Why no electoral impact? I think the key factor is that, okay, maybe the state was absent, maybe the leadership was absent, but the opposition is also absent. There's nobody there there are no faces to see. It's a completely state collapse in a way. For that 1 month, I think there was just nobody to be seen. So how can you kind of try to reap the benefits of something that you didn't participate in? How can the opposition hope to get those votes, right? Because if you didn't do anything yourself, and I think then people kind of have also this service delivery. I think that's, like I said, I'm repeating myself, but I think that was the key differentiating factor there.
And they further strengthened this as it came closer to elections.
Yeah.
So again, in terms of service delivery, so we have some surveys now from Himachal Pradesh, Assam, Rajasthan. I've spoken to people in UP, and the way the post-COVID and during COVID service delivery was targeted, we see that they tried to do it much better in the states where elections were going to be held, as say compared to Assam, which was a non-election state, and there probably they haven't done that much of it. And sometimes people do have short-term memories. I mean, COVID was such a trauma. Do you really want to keep thinking about what went wrong, or you want to move forward? The other thing we found in our research is this idea of multiple shocks. So vulnerable populations in India, in rural areas, are dealing with shocks on a day-to-day basis, environmental, social, political. And COVID was just one of those shocks in this arena of multiple shocks. And when BJP is targeting service deliveries, which are addressing these multiple shocks, COVID just becomes one of those in the larger spectrum. But your thoughts on Uttar Pradesh?
It's great to hear this analysis. I mean, I haven't been able to go to India since right before COVID, so I've kind of lost touch with what's actually happening on the ground. Uttar Pradesh, it's the key state in Indian elections. It's an electorate the size of Brazil, just to give you a comparison. It's commonly said that the road to Delhi goes via Lucknow, meaning that if you want to be the Prime Minister of India, you need to have power in Uttar Pradesh, because they send so many MPs to Parliament in Delhi. Before the elections, there were speculations about could the BJP win the election again? They could. That's actually unprecedented. It's the first time in more than 3 decades a government has been re-elected in Uttar Pradesh. Otherwise, it's been alternating between different parties or different coalitions of parties. There were speculations about what might damage the BJP. One thing was the farm law protests, which I think many of you will have heard about. It's been written about also in the Norwegian media, and this might be getting a bit technical, but it was protests that originated from the Punjab, primarily among Jat Sikhs. It then spread also into Haryana, where the Haryanvi Jats also became part of the movement, and into Western UP, where there's also a significant Jat population there. So the question was, will this farm law controversy do damage to the BJP in the western parts of UP, where there's a concentration of Jats? It did some damage, but not much. There was some sort of split in the Jat vote, that you might say, that members of this caste voted equally for the BJP and the Rashtriya Lok Dal, which is commonly seen as the Jat party, or used to be the Jat party, going back to Chaudhary Charan Singh. The other thing was more in eastern UP and has to do with the more violent side of Hindu nationalism, which has in the past 5 years registered as a crackdown on the beef trade. The banning of not only the slaughter of cows and cattle, but also in many cases crackdowns on even trade in cattle, on the assumption that if cattle is traded, it will sooner or later be slaughtered. So we have a situation where many farmers are stuck with unproductive cattle. They would sell it to someone. And with that money, they would perhaps eventually buy a new, younger, milk-giving cow. That's not been possible. They can't get rid of this cattle. It's costly to keep. It needs to be stall-fed, and it doesn't produce anything for you. So what happens is farmers simply, they release this cattle, they let it go. And it sounds trivial, maybe even anecdotal, but it's been a huge problem in eastern parts of UP, because this free-ranging cattle, it enters other people's fields, it eats the crops, it damages harvests, it does lots of economic damage, both to people who can't sell their cattle, but also to farmers whose crops are eaten. So the question was, would that be something, a protest vote against this cow vigilantism that's had really bad economic consequences? I saw an article this morning, I think, with a voter from East UP who said very clearly, yeah, stray cattle, it's a big issue. Cash transfers and rations, that's an even bigger issue. So we vote for Modi. So I think what you mentioned about this targeted, but also increasingly centralized service delivery, I think has been important for UP.
I also think the Modi factor can't be ruled out.
Yeah.
Some people in UP kind of think that he's kind of second coming or something. But they really respect. There's a lot of respect, and our relationship to our leader is very different from, so to say, the American relationship to the leader. We don't want to beer with our leader. We want to respect them, and I think a lot of people in India respect Modi and kind of their vote for BJP is a vote for Modi in many ways.
Especially, and this is not just UP, right? This is the cattle thing was actually, it's a problem in a lot of the states where people have livestock, they have cattle. And I think, I guess all of you know that why BJP is obsessed with cow, the whole bovine politics of it, because it's a holy animal in Hinduism. And so eating of beef is prohibited in so-called Modi, the Hindu version of Hinduism. And so there have been a lot of cases of lynching of people just on suspicion of them being in possession of beef. Although India is one of the largest exporters of buffalo meat.
I think it is the largest.
It is the largest exporter of buffalo meat at the same time.
But I think this is more like a dog whistle to kind of polarize society.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an anti-Muslim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is like a really anti-Muslim project saying, well, if you eat beef, you are a Muslim, and this is like the whole divide and rule that they have been continuing. And that is also really bad for these northeastern states, because we have northeastern states are mainly indigenous, or what we call scheduled tribe or tribal population, who actually do eat beef. And they have also managed to ban it across these northeastern states as well. So this cattle is a big problem even there. I was talking to farmers on the ground recently when I was there, the Nepalese who mainly rear cows, and you don't know what to do with this stray cattle anymore. And so yeah, so now from here, I guess the bigger questions we are asking is what next? Right? So what does it hold? What are the implications? So we see that these big issues, COVID and what we read on TV, like about Delta, so many people dying, none of that seem to have really impacted the everyday ordinary voter on ground. And what does this tell us? So 2024 is when India, we go for a national election. And actually a lot of the articles, so after this victory, Modi came out and he said that this tells us that we will be in power in 2024 as well. So BJP is looking at this as being in power. And this also brings to fore Modi's imagery, because you have to understand there are also other key people in BJP who are advising and aiding Modi, but Modi has been able to build this image for himself. That's also because, he's considered this single man who is unconditionally just working for the service of the nation. And as Shrey said, people like to look up to Modi. I mean, my parents vote for Modi. Shrey's parents vote for Modi, and it's very hard for us. In every Indian now even has a WhatsApp group where you go on praising the BJP. So it becomes very hard for us on an everyday to reconcile these. My brother works on the ground as part of one of the largest women empowerment projects in India called Kudambashri. And he tells me that the projects are actually being realized on the ground. BJP is delivering. For the first time, you can go to the most rural areas and you will see roads. You will see drinking water on the taps. You will see toilets, which hasn't happened.
For 70 years.
For 70 years of Congress rule. But does that mean it's as simple? No. I mean, what is the doing to the society, Kenneth? You have this welfare, but the complexity of this welfare.
It's, we've spent a good deal of time on the welfare component now, and I think that's important. At the same time, I think also as you mentioned, the polarizing agenda of Hindu nationalism. We didn't speak so much about this today. Which is probably why many of us are concerned about what we are seeing now, because it remains integral, I think, to what is, in my view, a state-building project. I mean, it's a BJP government that's in power, that has governmental ambitions, but I think it also has ambitions on behalf of India as a nation state. And that project walks hand in hand with other projects. There's sort of a welfarist project, and there's a neoliberal economic restructuring project, and they kind of walk hand in hand, and they are, in my view at least, held together by Modi, extremely successfully. And as you said, looking forward, I think, I mean, we may agree or disagree on what we think about Modi and Amit Shah, but they're worth listening to, because in terms of political astuteness and awareness, they know what's happening. And it's 20.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
So you asked also about 2024, and is it a foregone conclusion? Yeah, probably is. But there's something happening still, and you mentioned this about the collapse of the Congress, which has been a long drawn out process, at least from, I mean, depending on how far you want to trace it back, but at least it can be traced back many decades. I think the reason why, returning to Goa, we had, I mean, the Aam Aadmi Party, which by many is considered a regional Delhi, maybe now increasingly Punjab-based party, coming down to Goa to campaign there. Another party from the Bengal, 2,000 kilometers away on the other side, a party that's really a Bengali party, also traveling to an entirely different state. The language is different, the history is different, also trying their luck. I think there are many opposition parties who not only sense that the Congress is unable to, I mean, they can't win elections, basically. Somebody else has to win these elections, and who is that going to be? So I think there are many of these opposition parties now positioning themselves to reconfigure opposition politics. They have 2 years left. That's a very short time span.
They don't have enough time, I think, and it takes far longer to kind of come up with a good coalition that can actually defeat such a strong party. But I just wanted to say about this polarization. To me, it seems like BJP is also kind of discovering the limits. How far can they push this agenda? Like, I mean, they tried this Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Population Register, NRC. But they haven't been implemented. So in some ways, because I think the problem is that if we kind of this as a very overt anti-Muslim agenda, we risk alienating our neighbors. Bangladesh is a friendly country, and it's very easy to alienate them. And so our internal politics has also effects on our foreign politics, right? So it's not so straightforward. And I think BJP in the last few years has kind of been discovering how far are they able to push this. And I mean, can we say that if let's say in UP they did not polarize at all, can we really say that they would have lost?
Yeah.
I mean, in a counterfactual world, let's say they don't polarize at all in UP. I mean, it's hard to say if they would have won or lost. I mean, I don't think they would have lost, even if they hadn't polarized.
Yeah, that is a counterfactual. I mean, polarization it's many things. It's an electoral strategy that sometimes works in particular places, and it certainly doesn't work in others. So it's usually deployed selectively. I mean, West UP would be a place where that kind of politics would maybe pay off. Bihar is a place where it probably wouldn't. So, but I think it remains. I mean, it's not just an electoral strategy. It's also part of the ideological project. I would say,
So just to quickly chime in, so this issue of polarization is bigger than polity, right? Because it is seeping into everyday societal relationships in India. I mean, I grew up in Assam, which has we have had an anti-foreigners movement, which is basically we have share a border with Bangladesh. And the NRC was actually very prominent in Assam because Assam was one of the states that favored the NRC because they wanted the so-called Bangladeshis. I mean, these are actually citizens, maybe some are not, wanted them out of Assam. But now in Assam, because of the BJP coming to power, I see this polarization working out in your everyday relationship with the Muslim population. BJP has also done something called Ghar Wapsi, where they have tried to reconvert Muslims to Hindu. Hinduism as a principle is not a religion where you convert. You are born a Hindu. It's an ascribed status. But BJP has done that. We had something called love jihad. in UP. I mean, these are things that are extremely important, and that's why it's concerning. The Hindutva project is extremely concerning in terms of how it is reconfiguring state society and intra-societal relationships amongst people. So maybe a word on love jihad.
I think I don't want to say anything on love jihad, but I can talk about the general picture. Like the general picture, the idea is that the spectrum has shifted to the right a little bit. So no political party can now win an election without some sort of Hindu support. So that's I think the key to remember here. That every new party that comes in into the fray must have some sort of Hindu backing. Yeah. Maybe.
Like a Hindu, like the ideological, they will never overtly come and say that, oh yes, we are here.
No, some of them are actually
some of them, but the regional parties, you know, if you're
Aam Aadmi Party, for example, they are overtly, they're talking about Hinduism.
Some of them, yes.
The leader comes on TV and does a kind of like a prayer on TV.
Oh yeah, so there's also been this uptake of performing Hindu rituals and so on. So yeah, so every party now, as Shrey says, I mean, you have to have some sort of a leaning. I mean, the left is clearly absent in India at the moment.
Yeah, the left is clearly absent, I think, electorally, no?
Yeah.
I think this is I think it's a spot on analysis, and I think and this is not only of the BJP's making, it's also the RSS that you mentioned earlier that has done this sort of transformatory grassroots work over so many decades, that it has pulled politics in that direction where one of the candidate's prime assets is his or her ability to appear as a good Hindu. And in that, and I was reading a book recently by a French political scientist, Christophe Chaffrelot, who has written a book about the Modi years. And his conclusions are very similar. He says that, well, it's going to take a lot to oust the BJP from power. But even if they lose, it might not make much of a difference because the political common sense has been so transformed that unless there is some kind of broad-based social movement that can also work on transforming these, I mean, even intimate relations are now very polarized, as you mentioned, and that's not going to change with a change of government or a change of laws. So that's the twin challenge. If you are an oppositional politician, maybe of a leftist persuasion, even that the one thing is a change of government, but another is sort of the process of social transformation, and this is where the work of the RSS and Allied Association is so important, because that's been going on for a century now, and it's not going to be reversed by a 2024 election.
Right.
To give you like a very small, because I think empirical examples are important to contextualize, is traveling in rural Assam, and how the RSS works is they are, as Kenneth mentioned, they are so grassroots, they will really tune in to the grassroots kind of workings that are happening there. So BJP, of course, you would think that if it's pursuing a Hindutva ideology, it would actually be promoting so-called Hindu gods and goddesses, but that's not how it works. So we go to this rural Assam. So there is this guy, an Assamese idol called Shankar Dev, just to give an example, and he has a different ideology, and Shankar Dev worked towards mobilizing the Assamese society. So when BJP goes to Assam and starts an education program, they use Shankar Dev as an idol to push the Hindutva line of thought and teaching that to the children there. So what they're doing is they're not really taking things from Uttar Pradesh and trying to make it work in India. I think most of our development models need to learn from BJP. One size fits all is totally not what they do. They are extremely aware of the intricate societal relations in these societies, and they are pitching it spot on to make people work. And that's how these twin processes, different processes are actually coming together for them. And as Kenneth said, their project, the RSS project, is not just India. They look at something called Akhand Bharat, the undivided India, which stretches from
incorporates at least Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Up to Thailand.
Even further, all right, okay.
The map goes...
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's a whole big project, but I see that now maybe we conclude and ask some questions because we have 10 more minutes. Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Shrey. Thank you, myself. Well, yeah, I was doing both, right? Moderating and talking. So if you have questions, I would be very happy to take them. And also, as thanks to Bergen Global for organizing them. And if you want to attend more of these interesting events, I hope we were interesting for you too. You can follow us on this Twitter, I think Facebook, and newsletters. Yeah, that too. And yeah, so thank you everyone for being here today, this morning. Questions? Or comments, you know, we really would also like comments.
Yeah, one question, probably quite simple, but not that simple. What is the future of democracy in India?
We are a democracy, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about future.
Yeah, no, that's an important
Not
question.
right now. Yeah.
Oh, so the question is, what is the future of democracy in India? And that's a very important question to ask, I guess. So, Kenneth, if you know.
Well, it's a tough question, huh? And I mean, now it's India at 75 is coming up in August, no? So there'll be these celebrations about 75 years of independence. And I've been, many may have been part of this before. I was part of India at 70, India at 65, India at 60, going back quite some years. And I remember especially the 2007, I think there was a sort of vibrant atmosphere. That's when we had the first UPA government, which was seen as somewhat social democratic, a rudimentary sort of welfare state being built up. We had studies documenting that those who were most engaged in democracy were the poor, the marginalized, the historically disenfranchised. That was a sort of a moment of optimism when I look back in academic circles. The mood now is different, no? And I think people are trying to make sense of not just the future of Indian democracy, but the future of many other democracies at this, because it's a global thing. This reversal of democracy happening in many, well, across the globe. I mean, this is, if you measure the state of the world's democracy, this is the worst it's been for many, many decades. One concept that's been used to predict the future is a kind of a post-democratic India, where democracy remains in place, the institutions remain in place, but that they are more or less fully subservient to political control, being hollowed out. And again, to return to the Chevreul book I mentioned, he does it systematically. He works through the Supreme Court and the Election Commission in particular, which a decade ago we tended to think about as staunchly independent institutions that were kind of the guarantee that some of these procedural things would be upheld. I think there's a fee. I mean, I don't think that we'll see a dismantling of democratic institutions. I think many right-leaning regimes are quite comfortable with institutions of democracy to the extent that they can be made subservient to political agendas. And I think that process is underway in India across a range of these public institutions. And so that would be, I mean, if I were to guess, I think we would see that drifting continue. This sort of political meddling with many of the they would be continue to function. They would be in place, but they would be much less independent than what they might have been looking back some years.
I just want to add one point. I think, like, barring the 20 years of kind of like democratic peak in India, I think it's kind of been more or less the same. Before we had Indira Gandhi and we had all those people, and they were misusing these institutions all the time. And barring those 20 years where we had like a lot of political uncertainty, like in the 90s, it was a lot of parties, governments coming and going, and some in 2010, the 10 years then. I think after that, it's probably we back to kind of normal, how we would do it in India. Because democracy has always struggled. I mean, we can talk about like what's kind of how well it functions in India and how well it has functioned in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're right. And I didn't want to sound too alarmist, but I think there is a difference between Indira Gandhi and Modi. And that difference is that by the time the emergency was imposed, she had basically destroyed her own party and had no kind of organizational network beneath her. Modi does, and it's huge, you know. So I think there's a difference in kind of
I think
structure of things.
And just to add quickly to Kenneth, I think as Kenneth rightly mentions, the way we vision or the way democracy is operationalized at the moment is changing. So, you know, and it is almost like the co-option that has happened of state, society, religion, and the different institutions within these. I think that has really changed. And as I think, and this goes back to one of these points we made, is even if Modi goes out of power, what do we see on the ground? It will still be that kind of a democracy that will be operating in some ways. And you know, of late, I have also begun to question the so-called Western notions of democracy. And US, is the US in a place to dictate what democracy should be and all these democratic measurements in different countries? So we also have to be very critical of what we mean. You know, when we say democracy, and is democracy really the way it has been envisaged in the Western sense, be operationalized is in this fast changing, growing, transforming economies in the world.
And has it ever worked in India? Like, that's a question to ask.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, but this is what you are saying was the response of, I don't know the name of the minister, but one of the Modi's minister, that the West is not going to dictate us how democracy should be measured and operationalized. And tell me if I'm wrong, you are supporting the same argument or putting up the same argument, right?
Well, I'm not aware of him saying, but this has also been in the scholarship. We have been critiquing the different models of democracy. I mean, this was during my undergrad, we studied, is democracy the best form of governance? And we have been debating this for years.
And a lot of non-Western politicians and say the same thing.
Yeah, it's a very non-Western thing of saying like, you know, there are these different models.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's inspiring.
Yes, please.
Just taking a step back from the internal politics of India, what do you think now that BJP is an incumbent party, so to say? What do you think is going to happen in the more international scale? What do you think it's going to mean for India-Nepal relations, India-China relations, Pakistan relations, so on and so forth? A little bit of insight into that.
So the foreign policy has also largely shifted from the Nehruvian post and to Modi. Like, we abstained in the General Assembly right now on the Russia-Ukraine relations. So
but that's not. I think the Congress government would have done the same.
Probably it's about the kind of line we are towing. But I think our foreign policy has really shifted, especially I think in relation to the neighbors.
So I think that especially so when Modi came to power, the goal was let's talk to China directly.
Yeah.
That was but it has really failed. Like we have a very hostile relationship with China. But I think over the last few years, we have seen somewhat enough of an improvement in relations with Pakistan. Of course, you know, there are hostilities. I mean, this is starting from a very, very low bar. Really like a low bar. But I think there are some improvements. And I think there are some, I mean, if you follow kind of the discussions, seems like there's some back channel talk. So it seems like there is a little bit of a kind of improved relationship with Pakistan, but with China, it's very hostile. And I am not 100% sure of if that's to do with BJP or would it have been the same with Congress-ruled government. So, but I can say that our neighborhood has some impact. Like I talked about this CA and RC. So we can't like outright be anti-Muslim. I mean, not that we should be like, but it's very difficult because our neighborhood, then it becomes very complicated.
But one thing to mention is BJP, one thing that Modi's foreign policy has been is to take India to the center stage, so-called, in the world. So I think Modi made the highest number of foreign trips that any prime minister ever has in India ever since he came to power. Maybe because he likes to travel, we don't know, doesn't have a family, but he did, and it was strategic. He like went to every possible country to take India to that center stage. He wants, he has a very similar ideology in that sense as Trump, India first. We are really pursuing digital India, make in India. We are trying to, in some ways, at least show that we are not boycotting, like we don't want Chinese goods to come into
Chinese
India.
apps,
Chinese apps. So TikTok is banned in India. So in some ways, Modi really wants this kind of a, India as this almost a standalone global power emerging, and he's going and shaking hands with everyone. Was it Trump or Erdogan or, he has been.
But I think a lot of this is also like directed toward the Indian audience.
To the Indian audience as well.
So the Indians feel like this pride in being Indian. Like I think that's
the nationalism project is very intricately also linked to the foreign policy. But Kenneth, your thoughts?
I'm not a foreign policy expert. I think you're right in Modi wanting to raise India's standing on the global stage. I mean, it's partly for domestic consumption, but not only. I think he also wants to do it, and it's been a long-standing ambition also for Congress governments before. And in a sense, the kind of centralization of foreign policy in the prime minister is the way it's usually been in India, going back to Nehru, and it was only under maybe Manmohan Singh that there was a bit more sort of an actual foreign minister doing foreign policy, and not the prime minister. But I think maybe two things I think might complicate India's global ambitions now. I think one has been what happened under COVID, a very unusual case of most of the world suddenly aiding India in the midst of a domestic catastrophe. Yeah? Even smallish African countries sending emergency aid for India. It was an image thing basically, but that kind of maybe did something. Then the Ukrainian crisis, I'm not sure, it's too early to diagnose, but I see this from foreign policy analysts. India's abstaining from voting on this in the UN was expected. I think a Congress government would have done the same, and that has to do with historical ties with Russia and balancing land-based geopolitics in Asia, where Russia remains central and where the Americans aren't anymore because they left Afghanistan. But also the need to maintain good relations with the US. But the question is, how long can India abstain from a position without damaging some kind of relations? And aren't they capable of formulating a proactive international stance? They have very good reasons for not doing so, but it may still, who knows? But things are a bit up in the air, and it's an extremely tricky situation for India to handle, and I'm glad I'm not in charge of it. And I don't envy people who have to deal with this, because it's hugely complex.
When we had Nepal and Bhutan voting in favor, and India not. But so I think we have come to an end. Thank you so much again, and